The shift in terms of the technological availability, has that made coding easier? Is it just kind of like, I want to get a good summary, so I'm swapping from 3.5 to GPT-4? Or like, how do you think about that technical change side of making it an easier process to summarize books?
It was kind of a no-brainer, honestly. So token windows got larger, and so there was less need for chunking up chapters and splitting them up into paragraphs and sentences. Technical challenge that happened in the earlier days was creating summaries that were specific length. And there was a lot of sort of chunking and wrangling involved with predicting how large the summary output from OpenAI would be. But even then, that got much easier with GPT-4. The output of the AI model itself was higher quality, better structured, and way more consistent. So it was basically something you just get for free because of the new models.
Well, Vihar Desu, so excited to have you on the podcast today. You are doing a lot of interesting work, entrepreneur, engineer, developer, working on cancer genomics and AI at Tempest, as well as on your own products, including Summaries.co, which we'll be chatting about today. Excited to chat with you because I think there's a ton of really interesting areas to explore around the future of technology and AI in summaries, but also culture change around how we consume content, books writing, and then also like the technical challenges as part of that, and then also the future of publishing too, right? Like where is book publishing going in the world of AI when we can not only generate books themselves, but obviously like there's a lot of content that comes out and we could kind of work on summarizing books in pieces like that. So all that to say, great to have you on the podcast. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Excited to have a conversation.
Cool. So to kind of open us up then, you're working on some interesting projects. You're asking some interesting questions around, again, the idea of future of publishing. And so you're coming at this from the question of a technical standpoint, right? Kind of as an engineer, as a developer. And so to kind of like open us up, like let's talk a little bit about what you're looking at accomplishing around Summaries.co, but like thinking about this bigger question of like what inspired you to kind of figure out how do we condense a lot of knowledge into something that's a little bit more simple to consume.
The main idea behind Summaries.co is really just to be a digital library. And growing up, I used to go to the library, but I had an extremely short attention span, so I couldn't actually finish any of the books I've started. I would start.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah. But I definitely liked learning. So when GPT-3 came out, I was working with my friend Scott on some ideas jamming around AI. We initially started with article summaries, and we both basically wanted to have a Google Chrome extension that would allow us to quickly summarize random YouTube videos and Wikipedia articles as we were surfing the internet. And that quickly pivoted towards books because books were actually a really good medium to summarize because they were well-contained sets of information, and they could be abstracted and structured in appropriate ways. For example, if you wanted to split up a chapter, at that time, the token limits in GPT-3 were much shorter, and so we could basically summarize books in within those token limits. And then after doing it for a long time, we realized that the summaries were actually really good. They were improving as the models were getting better, and retrieval augmented search also started becoming more popular and unlocked a lot of opportunities. So all these things that I've always wanted to do with books, but never really could because they weren't accessible, all of a sudden became possible with these new language models that were coming out. So it just seemed like a cool engineering project to start tackling.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's an interesting piece too, because it's got me thinking about, I mean, I remember too, in college, I remember, when I was applying to college, it was like the last year they accepted paper applications. This is like 2002. But that's also meant we had the library, we'd go to obviously I know libraries still exist, especially in universities, but there is this interesting point of as things get more digital, right? It's changing the way that we can interact with with knowledge and with content. So that's an interesting point of kind of recognizing books and reading itself can be an accessibility issue, right? We're thinking about also because of the rise of like, text to speech engines and the idea of being able to listen. Also for me, I mean, part of the reason I even started doing this podcast was because I in graduate school realized, or I don't know, something happened and I became a super slow reader. And I was like, wait, I can't keep up with all this. And then at the time there was not like a bunch of, text to speech engines, but there was something important about being able to discuss and talk about issues too. And so this also became a way of me of trying to get more accessible knowledge, when like reading 300 pages felt a little bit undoable at times. It's really been interesting to then see like development around that area around accessibility, but then also coming into this idea of summarizing uh, literature, nonfiction books as well. And I appreciate your point of books kind of function as nice self-contained things, and like literally there's often chapter structures, right? So it's kind of easier for a system to see that, Um, and so thinking about this too, like it's funny because I was looking at a OpenAI article from 2021 the other day that was talking about like they're kind of doing this human in the loop summary checking system of like, it takes a long time to have a human read a book typically, unless you're some speed reader, but that's also how much you actually absorbing. I don't know. But then as you can get faster and better, like through GPT-3 and now we're GPT-4 and 4 Turbo now, your token limit gets higher, as well as then like the capacity for it to kind of think across bigger, swaths of content or text. So I think that's an interesting idea that so on one hand, like how has that changed? I guess as you think about like the shift in terms of the technological availability, has that made coding easier? I guess as you think about like kind of putting together, is it just kind of like I want to get a good summary, so I'm swapping from 3.5 to GPT-4, or like how did you think about that technical change side of making it an easier process to summarize books?
Yeah, it was kind of a no-brainer, honestly. So as
Yeah.
the models went from 3 to 3.5 to 4, at least OpenAI, the token windows got larger, and so there was less need for chunking up chapters and splitting them up
Mm,
into paragraphs and sentences. Um, and also the price got cheaper for those later stage models. So over time, it just became more of a commodity than it already was starting to be. So summarizing a whole book came out to around a few cents, and
wow.
um, also the quality of the summaries was a lot better. So it was much more reliable to just write up a simple script and generate a summary out of the box. The technical challenge that happened in the earlier days was creating summaries that were specific length. And
Mm,
there was a lot of sort of chunking and wrangling involved with predicting how large the summary output from OpenAI would be and using that to estimate how long the summary read length would then be.
mm,
But even then, that got much easier with GPT-4. And then the more later ones, like 1106 preview, um, the output of the AI model itself was higher quality, better structured, and and way more consistent. So
mm,
it was basically something you just get for free because of the new models.
which is never a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too because it's like as we head into this space, like there is a culture shift happening around publishing, right? And how we create content, and there's the on the other side of it is obviously when we say GPT-3 and GPT-4, these come from OpenAI, right? The AI company that is now world renowned. I mean, they were before too, but they're even more so now. But part of this challenge is that they are getting sued by 100 different content creator companies, journalists, newspapers, and publishing houses. And this is an interesting piece that there is the idea about copyrighted content and the other side of it in terms of like paid content. If I buy a book, um, do I get an audiobook version of it? Obviously, like Amazon has this model, right? You can buy the Kindle version, the physical version, or you can buy the audiobook. You can sometimes compile them for a minor discount, but like it's an interesting question of like accessibility. Um, and then the other side, there's this the author themselves, right? The person that's creating the content. And it's interesting that uh, you know, even when we were thinking about this idea at first, it was like, oh, there's, am I gonna like, not me, but like if I'm an author, am I gonna lose sales if I'm like getting a book summarized, And that's an interesting point to think about, because there's this concern of if I give away things for free, people won't want to pay for them. But then like I was reading this piece by David Kadavi the other day. The piece is called "How to Write a Book," But it's interesting that he was talking to Nir Eyal, like a behavioral science thinker, author, about this idea of like, if I give away my content, will nobody pay for it? And it turns out actually, like, especially if you bring in readers, audience members, like early on in your process, if you're like, you got a blog and then you like say, I'm gonna publish 30 things, in 30 days or whatever, or like once a week or something with you, share pieces of a chapter on a book that I'm writing, you're way more likely to get feedback, and people are going to have more buy-in to your content. And they're also, and the interesting thing they found was that like basically they'll also be the first people to pay for your book when it comes out, actually, versus like, I already got it for free, why would I pay for that? Because you're invested in that product, in that process, and so I think it was a really interesting idea. So I'm curious your thoughts, and I said a lot of things here, but just like, so we'll start on the publisher writer side. Like, I think that was really interesting, like on the author side, to realize that, I'm not going to lose out if I'm providing free content in addition to the actual book itself, even if it's publishing chapters. So I'm curious, like, your thoughts about this in terms of the kind of creator process and approach to providing free summaries, of written works.
Yeah. Well, I think in the current state of our society and LLMs coming in, what I wouldn't want to happen is authors now having a disincentive to creating their work. I think one of the biggest drivers of those books are cannibalizing sales, and we wouldn't want AI to come basically cannibalize those sales. And as far as this new medium that unlocks summarization and AI-enabled search, I sort of think of it as a cool new tool. And users can now interact with their favorite books or books that they have never read before in ways that they previously couldn't. And there are a lot of applications for that type of technology. So being able to understand what those novel applications are, as well as preventing any misuse of copyrighted material, is really important. And I think from the author's perspective, if these types of technologies can be leveraged to their advantage to actually promote books that people wouldn't otherwise know about, or allow people to engage with their content in ways other than just purchasing the book, and using them in ways where the authors can monetize, even against users that are not necessarily trying to read the full book, but maybe just parts of the book, or doing some research, and that book is related to that research. So I hope that this technology is a positive sum game when you look at authors versus large language models, and hopefully people in society don't view those two stakeholders as competitors, and rather try to find ways where both the technologies can be and stakeholders can be leveraged to benefit the rest of humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as you said too, like that before, that it does make us think about an accessibility issue, right? And it's funny because I was trying to think about what is the like slightly more analog correlate of doing book summaries. Obviously, there's things like Spark Notes and Cliff Notes that were around since we were kids, and those had it seems like this is kind of following on that model, right? And then there's this other piece that is, it's originally produced content, but it's like in peer-reviewed literature journals, you'll see folks doing reviews of books, and so it's like, what is it, a couple pages, 3 or 4 pages or something, and they'll talk about different chapter sections and like what the other subject matter expert thought about it. And like, when I was in graduate school, I would use those to like basically not see if I should read a book, but just like, what are people saying about that other content? And It's interesting to me because it's like that never ever flagged my radar as like, oh, this is kind of giving away what that book's about, because that wasn't the point. It's more like, how do you get into a conversation with scholarship, in this case, or nonfiction writing. And so I think that, yeah, that's why, like, it's an interesting piece that on the one hand, if you just walk into the room, it's like, oh crap, there's a bunch of like summarized books now. Like, now we don't have to buy anything. But then you like think about it as a legacy of technology in relationships people have already had with like working around content. Again, through Cliff Notes or like other people writing book reviews. I mean, Goodreads does this too, right? You go there and the people like write a very long review of a book that they liked, and here's why it was good. Thankfully, they'll sometimes say spoiler alert, or like the spoiler-free review or something. But it doesn't seem super different. So I'm curious your thoughts about this in terms of like, do you see summaries as like a legacy type of technology? Or is it like a net new thing? Like, how do you approach like what it's doing around writing?
Yeah, I mean, historically, you'd have to read an entire book and summarize it yourself and review it yourself. And that process, obviously, takes a lot of effort and intent, whereas you could throw a book into a large language model and get a summary in a few seconds or a review in a few seconds. It may not be of the same quality, but at least from the summaries perspective, they're pretty good quality. And so I think, is that fair? Probably not. Because for those who have been sort of monetizing off of these Spark Notes types platforms like Blinkist or Headway, their business model has sort of been disrupted. Now they can also do the same thing and use AI and not have to worry necessarily. But it does bring, I think, a bigger question to the authors, where now renditions of their content can be generated very quickly, cheaply, and efficiently, and by anyone in the world. And that does pose a threat to their authorship. So I think what makes sense for me, and what I think, if I'm sort of thinking about this from a society level, authors and content creators should have some sort of protection in the form of AI specific licenses for content. And I'm not sure if that exists yet, but I know that there have been conversations where sort of a music consortium sued OpenAI over illegally using, or claiming to be illegally using their content to train the OpenAI models. And there is some legislation, I guess, starting to shape around whether that is okay, and also whether the output of LLMs, if it references copyrighted content, is that okay? Is that kosher? And I think, I guess, in my opinion, the copyrighted input should definitely be paid for or licensed in some way or form, and then the output should be sourced. And if it's not spitting out content that is exactly the same as the copyrighted content, it's not technically the same. And so I don't think the same copyright infringement laws necessarily apply. But then on the third hand, in a completely different angle of things, if the content that is being monetized for this, in this case, if it's a book summary, is similar enough to the original book, I definitely think that there should be some AI specific licenses for these use cases, because I do think authors should have a strong incentive to want to create content and also be benefiting from the AI use of their content. And yeah, I hope they get on board / are interested by the opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because it's I do find myself kind of coming back to this, the on the author side, right, this point that some people might, if I write a book and it gets summarized, some people might say, okay, if I read the summary, I don't need to read your book. Yeah, okay. Like that's gonna happen. That's gonna happen anyway if they're gonna get a Spark Notes or a Goodreads summary of the book, or kind of review, I think. But then I think that a lot more people that actually want to engage with an author and their content and their writing, like, or could still do both, right? Because it's not like on the one hand, like from an experience standpoint, I'm like, oh, okay, I got a summary of a book, and that's actually very helpful if I'm doing quick research. But then also, like, I'm super intrigued by what you wrote, so then I actually do want to read a chapter of your book or read part of your book or something that, so it's like it's still like another kind of gateway, I think, into the author's work and their writing, and so I agree too. Like it's interesting, but like you can see how there's two kind of like an okay and a less okay feeling of it, if you're an author, a content creator, a writer. But at the same time, it's this funny point of like, as a podcaster, it's slightly different, but like someone can clip up any episode of my 200 episodes on YouTube or on any platform. And I have no idea if they're doing that. And they probably have done it. I know they've done some of it, but just like I have no idea how many like clips of this podcast exist out elsewhere. People use them in classes, which is nice. I never see that. I just hear like 2 years later, someone's like, oh yeah, I used your podcast in a class. Neat. How did it go? Was it useful? Like, it's less like, hey, you took my podcast. I'm more like, this is great. I want to know how it was useful to you, because the other side of it too is like, it actually, you think about it, generates more opportunities for people to engage with your content, or to even give you ideas of what else you could do. Obviously, like a podcast licensing in copyright is like different, because I'm not going through like a full branded network. Like they're written to me, but like, I'm not Audible or iHeartMedia. They're probably they have a lot more lawyers than I do, which is zero. But but to your point about publishing too, like I think it's an interesting question of like, will we see the rise of a new kind of license of this kind of content? Like, and I do think the other thing you said too of attribution, I think, is really important. Like, do we have a source of where the material comes from and how it was created? And do you think, I guess, like if we like kind of shine a light into that black box, as it were, like that, adding some transparency, I think would help. But like, I'm curious your thoughts about this. Of like, not that everybody wants to read the code, because but just more like, do people, if we can attribute the creation of summaries the right way, that seems like it opens some doors for either more transparency and more trust, between the industry and creators.
A part of this, I think, is a little bit of a technology limitation, which is quickly improving. There are tools like Perplexity out there where the generated responses do have attribution, and I do think that's where things will be heading. And in that sense, it's much easier to be able to link back to the original work and reference and credit the author that created the content. And I don't see how generating summaries for content should be any different. I think it should be the same. And the question that I think might be more salient to the author is the monetization. Like, if they feel threatened about people no longer wanting to buy books as a result, then that's definitely a separate consideration. But yeah, in my opinion, for someone that probably would not have read a full book or listened to the full audiobook, but wanted to get the sound bites, this type of tool is something that I would love, and which is why I built it. But I think there's probably sort of a Venn diagram of books that I want to read / am curious about, but will end up not reading. And I think a lot of people definitely have a whole intersection of books where they definitely want to engage with the content, understand the ideas, but not necessarily read the whole book. And so if that's viewed as a proper market, which it's somewhat already established with existing players, I think there's an opportunity to establish ground rules for monetization. And then in the other use case, I do have books that I've read multiple times, and one of those is The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee. And this tool also is something I built specifically for that book because
Cool.
it's so densely packed with knowledge. There's 800 pages of history, and um, I'm really into genetics, and so
Mhm.
that book for me is something that I just want to have hundreds of quotes all over the book cited and
Mhm.
for my own personal reference. But I remember reading it and wanting to be like, oh, I wish I could just ask this book, like, to create me a timeline of all the historical research experiments that contributed to the advancement of the field. And
That'd be cool.
it would be cool if you could just, ask a book all these random questions, and it spits out answers for you. And that's literally why um, I started working on this project, because I can engage with these books that I like in a way that I wasn't able to before. Um,
Mm.
and you could kind of extrapolate that out to how that could be really powerful for a researcher. Now, they can ask questions and see real references to a lot of theories and ideas in 50 books at a time, and
Mhm.
do some really interesting comparison across the literature, and analysis across the literature. And um, you just can't do this with books right now. You might be able to do that
Yeah.
in the research field, and a lot of that work is open source, but you can't really do that with books.
You just made me think of something that it's interesting that so a book is obviously longer than a peer reviewed article or journal article, right? But it's like in terms of monetization question, like authors typically academics are not paid to write journal articles, right? They like will publish them whether open access or not, and like then they're copyrighted to the author, but then through a publishing house, um, and then typically other users through institutional licenses or individually have to then pay to get access to those journal articles. But the authors of peer reviewed stuff never get paid for those. And this is an interesting question that I mean that itself I think is already an unfair model because academics do a ton of work that goes super under or unpaid. And like literally contributing to the knowledge base of humanity and not you don't get paid for it um, sure some people might say it's a noble pursuit, but at the same time somebody's getting paid for that. And it's an interesting question there of like uh, there is this concern of like, oh wait, well you can't summarize a book because then someone's not gonna they're not gonna get paid for it. And you're like, put that in conversation with journals, and they're not getting paid anyway.
Right.
And not that that means like we need to magically give it away, but like I think it's when you think about it from this angle of the monetization, because I think it's the right angle to think about it. Or like one of the important angles to think about this is that the conversation isn't equal on the other side anyway, right? In terms of articles versus books. And that raises a really interesting question because you're right. The other side of it, where you can now like drop in some PDFs, EPUBs, or whatever, and then be able to chat across literature. Like there's products like Elicit I'm thinking of too that you can then look up a bunch of things. You can connect your Zotero if you want, and then like look across and compare research or consensus. Another great app that you can then like ask scientific questions and see what is the consensus of the scientific literature across papers. You can choose to read them or not, but like uh, this is an interesting idea in terms of what does access mean and like how are these, because again both these are drawing on peer reviewed literature which typically does not pay the authors to produce the content. And that's interesting. I guess I don't know, I've not thought about this between like peer reviewed versus book. So what is does that raise any red flags or questions for you in this in there?
The publishers and authors have slightly different incentive structures, obviously, than researchers. And I think in this, for researchers, honestly, I think having their work reach the widest audience and gaining a lot of visibility actually probably is a huge incentive for their
Mm-hmm.
work to be public, and accessible. And to the extent that more people cite their work, that's good for them.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, that is true for authors as well. It's except with an asterisk where you don't want their complete work open to the public, even though there are ways to get that content for free. I do think that having it having books properly purchased and read in its entirety is probably a, just a different way of consuming content
Mm-hmm.
altogether. Because while research is primarily around the few ideas to advance a very specific niche hypothesis forward, or help with a different hypothesis, um, books, I think, are well researched, long form pieces of content that are primarily for leisure, whether it's fiction or
Mm.
nonfiction. Uh, but there are different ways to promote those ideas other than just buying and reading the book. And um, those I've seen a lot of sound bites on TikTok and YouTube of the ideas around
Mm-hmm.
books. For example, 48 Laws of Power. There's hundreds of TikToks
Mm.
about like summaries of the 48 Laws of Power. Um, and in that sense, the idea is being propagated in society in these mediums that are not the book
Mm-hmm.
itself. Uh, and I think that probably is more true for nonfiction than fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that in a way it's marketing for the
Yeah.
book. And if people are interested enough to read the full book, then they will.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a great point actually. Because we often don't think about that, where it's like, okay, we're making a text-based summary, but if someone's like reciting part of the book on TikTok, or they're going through all 48 laws in like different videos, like that's an interesting point of like, okay, they technically just summarized the entire book, but they're just talking on video. Does that somehow not count? And it's like, well, I think of course it would, right? But it's like that's a really interesting point that we can sometimes get mixed up in the medium, right? And think that if it's text-based versus a video, that it's somehow more or less infringy feeling, Um, but I think you made the other good point there in terms about like cultural influence, right? It's that like, especially for scholars too. I know like they're not a specific focus, but I'm going back and forth between them because it's like they're the mental foil in my head of like the people that would be like, well, hey, you can't be doing this, you like, but at the same time, it's like the point of scholarship is to disseminate knowledge, hopefully into the public, right? To advance human thinking and whatever other noble sounding nice things, and it's like this, whether that's like a business book or it is a piece of peer reviewed journal scholarship. I don't know any like, I'm sure there's some, but I can't think of any like either author or professor teacher that's like, no, I don't want my stuff out in public. I don't want people to know about my work. It's like, well, then why'd you write it? Put it on your Zenga or something, or your MySpace page, and then don't don't share it. But it's like this
Yeah.
interesting question of like, yeah, like that's one thing I think that I think most authors share as a goal is like, I would like to get my ideas out there. So it's an interesting question of like, how walled is that garden, and is it just the book, or is it the ideas of people talking about my book, which is what most people would probably want. So it's interesting. Like there's basically just, it's on some hand it seems a bit like a summaries like project is like adding just another layer of potential dissemination, kind of as you're saying. Um, and then
Mhm.
as much as we can, thinking smartly about like both the monetization aspect of that. Because I guess the flip side of it too, like if I'm making a TikTok video talking about the 48 laws of power, I'm not paying the author to talk about that, right? And they're not getting paid either. I don't think so. Maybe they are, but
Mhm.
um, that's an interesting question of like, yeah, that the access piece there. And to that point, there has to be like, there's like the AI specific license that we are talking about before, but then there's also this of like, can I just publicly talk about it? And that you can do, right? And this is like the it's not even a loophole, right? But this is what like Blinkist and Headway and Cliff Notes also gets around, right? They you can produce like, I'm not sure what the term is, right? But it's like a, not a derivative work, but it's like a reflection of the content or something. You're talking about something. It's like you can't use the
Uh-huh.
wording, but you can talk about the ideas in another format, and
Mhm.
that's an interesting kind of piece to think that the precedent exists, and so I think you're probably right too, that we're like heading in a direction that there will be some kind of AI specific license also as people think about this attribution question. I mean, even OpenAI recently said they were talking about ways like a product that will come out in 2025 that's like content creators can like submit through them, and so that way it's like they will have things sort of attributed. But again, but the fact is, so right now it's May 2024, and so the fact that we hear big open AI saying next year at some point we're going to be launching this product where you can get attribution tells you how big of an issue this is too, right? How hard it is actually to add metadata on some format to content like this that gets submitted through that gets crunched through their model. So that's an interesting piece, of what the future of that might look like. But it's like shows us that the problem is like big enough that people are trying to think through it. But I think also like there's a huge opportunity, right? Because we're talking about here too, that like there's a lot of potential of what can be done in terms of adding a new kind of cultural touchstone so people can access materials in more ways. I think about that too, like in terms of access. I want to come back to the mention of the cell you had before, and like not the cell, just cell. The cell would be the Jennifer Lopez movie from the I don't know,
This is
early 2000s. But the idea when you said of like it'd be cool to both talk to the book and like ask questions, make a timeline, and we have the summary piece. So how do you think about these two ideas of summarizing versus like being able to talk to a book, like because now you can dump a PDF and have a little chat with it. So how do you think about these two pieces together, summaries as well as like kind of talking to a book and asking new questions?
Yeah, they're both. So there's the technology piece, and there's also the uh, user unlock piece. So the user unlock, I think, is really cool because now you can basically engage with a entire library of work and jump around from book to book and collections of books to collections of books and learn whatever you want to learn, which is kind of the whole point. And the thing that got me excited about the search capability is having metadata of books across the world and the whole canon of books in specific genres, and being able to directly compare the works. So, for example, there's a lot of theory on the psychology of happiness and a lot of books written about the psychology of happiness and mental health and depression and their neurological underpinnings of depression and mental health. And it would be really cool to be able to understand that world by just asking this agent that has preloaded with all these relevant books very specific questions, and then being able to jump to specific pages in a book to read a little excerpt or paragraph of the work to better understand them, how the AI generated that response, and just get a better understanding of different fields. So that seems really cool. It's not something that I've ever really been able to do in a different medium. And books are interesting in that way because they are a vehicle for information, but they're very well contained. And if you were to try to do the same thing on Google search or Perplexity or YouTube, you wouldn't really get the same experience, because on Google search, you'd be linked to a lot of these one-off unrelated articles. In YouTube, you don't necessarily know what you're going to consume when you click on the piece of content, and if it's going to be good or reliable. And then with summaries, I think you can engage with the content to the level of detail that you're interested in. So a one pager versus a 60-minute read obviously gives you a huge range in depth.
Yeah.
And so once you've sort of identified a type of content or book that you want to consume, and you start going down the path of diving deeper into it, I think that level of depth really allows you to engage with the content how you want to. So it basically gives you more freedom. And from a technology perspective, it's really interesting to see what people care about. So as they're navigating these random book summaries, it's interesting to see whether they gravitate towards one page or the 60-minute read, and looking at things at sort of like a high level aggregated perspective.
Yeah. Have you noticed patterns so far? Like, do people typically go for a shorter? Because so you produce like you'll do there's like a one pager, there's like a chapter by chapter, right? And then there's a key takeaways. Like, do you find people that gravitate towards the shortest, or like is there kind of an interesting middle ground of like they happen to read the 30-minute summary? Yeah,
I think it's the 30-minute one.
interesting.
A lot of people like, and there's also some 60-minute and 15-minute ones, but I think the 30-minute one captures a solid amount of detail without necessarily losing some of that information.
Yeah. How do you? I mean, technically, I'm trying to. How do we think about that? Like, just in terms of 15 minutes is how long it takes me to read it, not how long the thing is, right? I mean, they correlate, but how do you like even approach that of like how long that is versus 30-minute read versus 60-minute read, like on the back end?
Yeah, there was some hacking involved. It's not perfect, but basically every book length is different, and it might range from 80,000 words to 160,000 words, and then each chapter is different, but roughly 4,000 words. And from the perspective of summarizing each chapter has a number of tokens that correlates or corresponds to the token limit in OpenAI. The interesting piece is with sort of like prompt engineering, where depending on the type of prompt you give the model, the output summary is a different length. So you can imagine, summarize this chapter in 3 paragraphs versus summarize this chapter in 10 paragraphs, on average produces different lengths of summaries. And so that piece of information is used to determine the output length of the chapter summaries, and the average reading speed of a person is used to come up with that number of 30-minute read and 60-minute read. So it's kind of it's like a very rudimentary assumption of the average person reads 250 words per minute. And then the layers before that are sort of just a heuristic of, is this model going to output roughly 250 words, or like roughly 1,000 words for a chapter summary, for example.
Yeah, cool. Oh, no, that's super helpful because it's an interesting idea to think about, like, because it's like if folks are not engineers, right? It's interesting to okay, wait, how do I think about like if I'm putting together the like code base to then have it give us a certain length that then translates to my human experience of reading 15 minutes, right? But understanding that like it's this interesting mix of human reading averages and making it match relatively that area in terms of word length and pieces like that. It's a cool. It's for me, it's fun. I mean, this is me being a tech nerd too, but like it's fun to kind of then say, okay, like we can actually do some interesting backwards math to get a sense of how long this needs to be. Then think about how do I ask the system to do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think programming is cool, but I'm a very poor new programmer, so that's probably why I think it's cool.
It's cool.
But yeah, it's good. So see, you heard it here, folks. It is cool. That's the way. But hey, Vihar, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been a lot of fun to chat with you. So just as a quick wrap up, like, what are you excited about? Either around summaries or just like where this kind of technology is taking us. Like, where do you see the future going in the next couple of years that you're really excited for?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was super exciting to be here. I think the search capabilities are what I'm most excited about, and specifically document store specific search. So as people are unlocked the ability to ask questions to their own private database of information, I think it will be really cool to see where these AI search capabilities go, especially if you imagine navigating all different types of content like Excel spreadsheets, PDFs, videos, and being able to kind of synthesize that information and answer specific questions a user might have for the research they're doing or the analysis that they're doing for whatever work their job entails. I think it's going to be really powerful. It's going to unlock a lot of automation around research.
Cool. I think it's a very interesting future. Excited to see. So we'll have to jump in again in the future as the future arrives and see what we see where we are next. But cool. Thank you so much for joining me on the pod, and yeah, keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.